Your knees crack going down the stairs, and your lower back locks up if you sit too long. In a rice paddy in Okinawa, Japan, a 94-year-old woman is doing deep squats with no joint supplement in sight. Japanese researchers found that nearly 7 in 10 Japanese women over 70 show knee arthritis on an X-ray, worse than most of the West. But Japan still holds the longest healthy life expectancy on Earth. So whatever keeps people moving was never sold in a bottle. It comes down to 5 habits, and the strangest one is a radio broadcast from 1928. Let's start with the knees themselves, since that's usually the actual complaint people search for at 2 in the morning. In 2007, a team at Shinshu University in Nagano ran a study that quietly overturned a lot of standard walking advice. They took a group of older adults, most in their 60s, and split them 3 ways. One group kept their normal routine. One walked at a steady, comfortable pace. The third did something odd on purpose. 3 minutes walking briskly, fast enough that finishing a full sentence gets hard, then 3 minutes walking slow enough to fully recover, repeated 5 times for about 30 minutes total. After 5 months, the interval group didn't just get more fit, their knee extension strength climbed 13%. Knee flexion, the muscles that bend the knee and absorb shock going down a flight of stairs, climbed 17%. Aerobic capacity went up 10%. Systolic blood pressure dropped by roughly 9 points, the kind of number a cardiologist would usually want a prescription to reach. Researchers gave the method a name, interval walking training, and it's since been repeated in group after group of older Japanese adults, including a 2025 trial in people managing type 2 diabetes, where the same 3 and 3 rhythm improved blood sugar control beyond what steady walking managed alone. A huge share of what people call joint pain past a certain age comes down to weak muscle around the joint failing to absorb impact the way it used to, forcing the joint to take the hit instead, rather than cartilage suddenly falling apart on its own. Rebuild the muscle, and you're not just walking easier. You're pulling load directly off the part that's been complaining. The reason this specific protocol beats a plain stroll isn't mysterious either. Running slams 2 to 3 times your body weight through the knee with every stride, which is exactly what wears people down over the years. Interval walking never leaves the ground, so the joint never takes that impact spike, but the fast bursts still push your heart rate high enough to force real adaptation. You get the training effect of harder exercise without paying cartilage for it. Posture matters here too. Done properly, it means spine tall, core braced, landing softly through the whole foot instead of slamming the heel down with every step. That single adjustment is part of why people who take up the practice often report their lower back easing off as a side effect nobody promised them going in. None of this needs new shoes or a gym membership. A park, a hallway, a phone timer. 3 minutes fast, 3 minutes slow, 5 rounds. If your knees currently ache on a single flight of stairs, this is the unglamorous answer the research keeps landing on. Not a cream, not a capsule, a specific ratio of speed you could start tomorrow morning before coffee. But the knees were never the whole story, because a joint doesn't ache in isolation from the rest of the body. Underneath a lot of that same stiffness sits a hormone nobody thinks to blame: cortisol. Japan's forestry ministry coined a name for something else entirely back in 1982, Shinrin-yoku forest bathing. Not hiking for exercise, just being in a forest, deliberately, with your senses actually open to it. The smell of wet pine bark, the specific quiet under a canopy that a city block never has. A researcher named Yoshifumi Miyazaki ran physiological tests across 24 forests nationwide, comparing people who walked through woodland to people who walked through a city block instead. The forest group's salivary cortisol measured lower at every single checkpoint of the day. Blood pressure dropped, pulse slowed. And cortisol is exactly the hormone that, kept elevated day after day, tells your body to store fat specifically around the belly, the stubborn kind that ignores sit-ups entirely. A separate study out of Nagano in 2019 took middle-aged men on day trips into an actual birthplace of the practice, a forest called Akasawa Shizenkyurin, and drew their blood before and after. Serotonin rose, fatigue scores dropped, their self-reported sleep quality improved that same night, not weeks later, which matters because bad sleep is its own quiet driver of both weight gain and pain sensitivity. You don't need a remote forest for any of this to register. Part of the mechanism is the trees themselves, plant compounds called phytoncides the body responds to on contact, and part of it is simply removing the low-grade alertness of traffic, screens, and noise for a while. 20 or 30 minutes, phone away, somewhere with actual trees overhead. It's not a supplement. It's a reset switch on a hormone that's quietly running under every ache you have, whether you've ever heard its name or not. Lowering cortisol helps. It doesn't cancel out what's still sitting on the plate in front of you, though, and that's where Okinawa comes back into the picture. In 1975, a physician named Makoto Suzuki started tracking the oldest people on the island of Okinawa and kept running into the same pattern: cleaner arteries, lower rates of diabetes, heart disease, certain cancers. One habit nearly everyone he interviewed repeated back to him unprompted: Harahachi Bu, eat until you're about 80% full, then stop on purpose before the plate is empty. Historically, Okinawans were eating something like 10 to 15% fewer calories than standard guidelines would suggest, not through restriction or counting, but through this one rule of stopping early. The meals were built around it too: deep purple sweet potato, soy, a wide rotation of vegetables, light on refined grains, and red meat, naturally lower on the glycemic index, meaning they don't spike blood sugar the way a fast, refined meal does. That matters directly for anyone whose blood sugar swings hard enough to leave them foggy and starving 2 hours after eating. For decades, this one prefecture measured a life expectancy around 83.8 years, against roughly 78.9 in the United States over the same stretch, and healthy life expectancy kept pace with it, meaning years spent still functional, not just years added at the end. It's part of why Okinawa ended up named one of the world's 5 blue zones in the mid-2000s, regions researchers identified specifically for having an unusually high share of residents who make it to 100. There's no trick hiding inside Harahachi Bu. It's slower eating and a decision to stop at 80% instead of 100, repeated at every single meal for 60 plus years. Boring, unglamorous, free. Apparently enough to change an entire island's relationship with blood sugar and body weight without anyone stepping on a scale. Eating less helps the blood sugar side of things. There's one specific food on that same plate that does something stranger, and it smells like it too. Natto is fermented soybeans. Sticky, stringy, pulling into thin threads the moment a spoon touches it, and by most Western palates' first reaction, an acquired smell. It's also been a breakfast staple across Japan for centuries, usually spooned straight over rice with a little soy sauce, mustard, and chopped green onions stirred through. The fermentation itself, driven by a bacterium called Bacillus subtilis, produces an enzyme called nattokinase, first isolated by a Japanese researcher named Hiroyuki Sumi in the 1980s. In a 2008 randomized controlled trial, people taking nattokinase saw measurable drops in blood pressure over 8 weeks. Separately, researchers tracking postmenopausal Japanese women found that higher natto intake was linked to a lower risk of osteoporotic fracture, and a 2021 review tied regular natto consumption to better bone density at the hip. That matters for joints specifically, because bone and joint health were never separate systems. Weak bone around a joint changes how load travels through it, the same way weak muscle does. There's a gut angle sitting underneath all of it too. Fermented foods, natto included, introduce live bacteria and byproducts your gut otherwise never sees from a typical Western plate, and a gut running smoother tends to show up downstream as less overall systemic inflammation, the same low-grade inflammation that keeps joints cranky in the first place. Miso works that same fermented angle from a different direction, a spoonful stirred into soup most mornings. None of this needed a capsule. It needed sticky, fermented soybeans, 3 or 4 mornings a week, and a willingness to get past the smell. Fermented soy handles one corner of the plate. What's sitting in the cup right next to it handles another. Green tea shows up at nearly every meal across Japan, plain, unsweetened, slightly bitter and grassy on the tongue, and the compounds responsible for most of its reputation are called catechins, with one specific type, EGCG, doing most of the actual work. A meta-analysis pooling 20 separate randomized trials, more than 1,400 participants combined, found that green tea catechins measurably lowered both total and LDL cholesterol against a control group, not a dramatic drop, a real one, and one that held up across 2 decades of research instead of a single flashy headline. The brain fog piece is newer and more interesting. A placebo-controlled study gave adults in their 50s and 60s roughly 336 milligrams of green tea catechins daily. After 12 weeks, their reaction time on a sustained attention test got measurably faster, the exact kind of test that catches the mental sluggishness people describe as brain fog. Separately, researchers tracking large groups in Japan have linked drinking somewhere around 2 to 8 cups of green tea a day to a lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, which lines up with the cholesterol numbers rather than fighting them. Nobody's claiming a cup of tea rewires cognition overnight, but a compound sitting inside something Japanese households drink multiple times a day is quietly doing double duty on cholesterol and mental sharpness at once. That's the pattern running underneath every single habit so far, whether it's walking in short bursts, time under trees, stopping at 80%, sticky beans at breakfast, or a plain cup of bitter tea. Small, repeated, boring inputs stacked on top of each other for decades, never one miracle ingredient carrying the whole load alone. This is usually where people get skeptical, and fair enough. 5 small habits sound too modest to explain a whole country's joints holding up into their 90s. So look at what happens across Japan at exactly 6:30 every single morning, because it's the part that ties everything else together. In 1928, Japan's national broadcaster began airing a set of stretches and movements over the radio, timed to a specific, slightly jaunty piano melody built for absolutely everyone regardless of age or fitness, bending side to side, twisting at the waist, swinging the arms overhead, marching in place, touching the toes, the same 13 movements today as decades ago, packed into about 10 minutes. It got banned briefly after World War II, considered too close to the militarism of the era it came from. NHK brought it back anyway in 1951, and it never stopped again. Nearly a century later, an estimated 27 million people in Japan still do it at least twice a week. Office workers do it in parking lots before their shift starts. School children do it every morning of summer vacation to earn a stamp on a card, the kind of small ritual that turns into muscle memory nobody thinks twice about by adulthood. And in one interview project with the oldest residents of Okinawa, researchers found that virtually every centenarian they spoke to still did some version of it daily. Some of them did it from a wheelchair. Some of them were missing full range of motion in a joint they'd long since accepted as permanently stiff. Notice what those 13 movements actually are. Twisting and side bending are exactly the motions a stiff lower back loses first. Arm swings and overhead reaches are exactly what a tight shoulder and upper spine lose first. It isn't a supplement, a superfood, or a single study. It's the same 10 minutes of full body mobility, repeated daily since childhood, for people who never stopped moving long enough for any one joint to seize up in the first place. That's the actual reveal sitting underneath all 5 habits. None of them is intense, and none of them costs anything close to a supplement subscription. 10 minutes of gentle stretching on the radio, sticky beans at breakfast, walking in 3-minute bursts, stopping at 80% full, 20 quiet minutes near actual trees, all 5 folded into one completely ordinary week. Every single one of them is something a 94-year-old even one in a wheelchair, can still physically do. That's not an accident, that's the entire design. So here's the uncomfortable part. None of these 5 things needed a gym membership, a prescription, or a supplement bottle sitting on the counter. They needed something small, repeated every day for decades without ever stopping, which is a much higher bar than swallowing a pill once and hoping. If you want the exact 3-minute interval walking protocol laid out step by step, that breakdown is coming next. If you've actually tried any of this yourself, tell me in the comments whether your knees or your gut noticed first. And ask yourself this: if the real fix was always this cheap and this boring, would you have taken it seriously without the research proving it first?